I have never told this story to anyone. Not even in the taverns of the farthest ports, where tales of sea monsters are as common as cheap rum. Some secrets are like poison. Keeping them inside eats away at the soul, but sharing them can be just as deadly. Now that my days are numbered, I must free myself from this burden. I was the captain of the Havfrun, a well-regarded Danish fishing vessel that had sailed the seas for over 15 years under my command. The ship wasn't grand, but it was sturdy and reliable, with its aged oak hull and sails that had weathered storms in every corner of the world. My crew consisted of 30 seasoned men, many of whom had sailed with me for years. They knew the sea like the calloused palms of their hands and respected both its wrath and its grace. On that particular voyage, my nephew Jens had joined us, a 16-year-old boy with narrow shoulders and eyes that still held the sparkle of youthful innocence. He was the only son of my late sister Karen, who on her deathbed made me promise to care for the boy as if he were my own flesh and blood. "Make him a man of character," were her final words. So when Jens showed interest in the sea, I couldn't refuse his request to accompany me. It was his first great maritime adventure, and I could see the excitement in his eyes as he learned every rope, every knot, every navigational instruction. He absorbed everything with a thirst for knowledge that reminded me of myself when I was young, before the salt of the sea and life's hardships had hardened me. We departed from the port of Copenhagen on a clear-skied morning, with favorable winds filling our sails. Our course was set for waters rich in valuable species in the Indian Ocean. The journey promised to be profitable, and the first days passed without any noteworthy incidents. Jens adapted well to the rhythm of life at sea, even overcoming the seasickness that often plagues novice sailors. However, after 2 weeks of sailing, as we neared our destination, the sky began to darken ominously on the horizon. My first mate, Lars, a man with 40 years of naval experience, looked at the approaching clouds and shook his head with concern. "Captain Valdemar, that's no ordinary storm," he said, his wrinkles deepening as he pointed to the horizon. "I've seen many in my life, but this one has a different look." I felt it too. The atmosphere had shifted, turning heavy like lead. The seabirds that usually accompanied us had vanished entirely. The sea itself seemed to have gone quiet, as if holding its breath before a great event. I ordered the crew to reef some of the sails and secure all equipment. I called Jens and instructed him to stay below deck during the storm, but the boy insisted on staying by my side. "How will I learn to face the sea if I hide from it, Uncle?" he argued, with a determination that filled me with pride, despite the fear I felt for his safety. When the storm finally hit us, it did so with a fury I had never witnessed in all my years at sea. Towering waves rose around us like liquid mountains, threatening to swallow our ship. The sky became a black maelstrom, broken only by flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated our surroundings. The thunder's roar was deafening, and the rain fell like sharp needles against our skin. For 3 days and 3 nights, we fought that force of nature. No rest, no moment of respite. The crew worked in grueling shifts, pumping out water from the flooded hold, adjusting the remaining sails, and trying to keep us on course against winds that seemed to change direction every hour. I saw strong men cry from exhaustion. I saw seasoned sailors clutch talismans and whisper prayers to gods they had long forgotten. And I saw my nephew Jens work tirelessly, his young hands bleeding from the rope friction, but never letting out a single groan of pain or despair. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally subsided. We emerged into clear skies and a calm sea, as if all that fury had never existed. But our relief was short-lived once we saw the extent of the damage to the ship. The mainmast was damaged, part of the bow was compromised, and worse, our navigation instruments had been destroyed. By the saltwater, we were adrift, with no precise idea of our location. Our provisions, though damp, were still enough to last a few weeks, which gave us some comfort. Using ancient star navigation techniques, I tried to estimate our position, while the crew focused on urgent repairs. On the 3rd evening adrift, we spotted land. An island rose on the horizon like a mirage, its silhouette cut against the setting sun. The crew erupted in cheers of joy and relief. I consulted the worn maps I kept in my cabin, trying to identify this patch of land. My heart froze when I finally recognized it. It was North Sentinel Island, a place infamous in maritime lore. Even the most experienced sailors among my crew paled when I announced our location. The island was known not only for its hostile people who rejected any contact with the outside world, but also for dark legends no sane man dared speak aloud. The Sentinelese were considered one of the last truly isolated peoples on the planet. Stories of ships that ventured too close to those shores always ended in tragedy. They said poisoned arrows rained down on any vessel daring to enter their waters, and that the few survivors spoke of bloody rituals seen from afar on the beaches. But there were other stories whispered only in the darkest hours of the night, when rum had loosened the tongues of older sailors. Stories about creatures that were neither human nor animal, that emerged from the waters around the island during full moons. Creatures that sang with voices so beautiful they made grown men weep like children, luring them into the depths where they were never seen again. "Captain, we can't get near that place," said Lars, his normally steady voice now trembling. "It's cursed. We have no choice," I replied, though I felt the same dread. "Our ship won't survive unless we make the necessary repairs, and we need solid ground for that." We decided to anchor at what we considered a safe distance from the shore, where we could work on the hull damage without provoking the island's inhabitants. As the sun fully set, I watched the coastline through my spyglass. The dense vegetation seemed to move with a life of its own, and now and then I thought I saw the glint of eyes watching us from the distant beach. On the night we were to anchor and begin repairs, I gave strict orders that no one was to attempt going ashore and that we were to double our watch. The full moon had risen high in the sky, bathing the waters around us in a silvery light that cast restless shadows across the deck. That was when we heard the singing. At first, it was just a whisper carried by the night breeze, so faint I doubted my own ears. A long, mournful note, followed by a modulation no human instrument could replicate. Gradually, that ethereal sound grew clearer. A melody so sweet it seemed impossible it could have come from anything of this earth. It was as if the ocean itself were singing, calling to us, promising secrets and pleasures no mortal man had ever known. Jens was beside me on deck when the song began. I saw his eyes, usually bright and alert, glaze over as if he were staring at something far beyond the visible horizon. "Uncle Valdemar, do you hear that?" Jens asked, his wide eyes reflecting the moonlight. His voice sounded distant, as though he himself were struggling against the pull of that supernatural song. "Yes," I replied, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. It wasn't just fear I felt, but something more primal, an ancient survival instinct that screamed inside me like an alarm. "Wake the men, something's not right." I tried to move, but my own limbs felt heavy, reluctant to obey the commands from my brain. The singing, that cursed singing, seemed to seep into my consciousness like mist through a forest, obscuring thought and intention. Only decades of maritime discipline and a strong sense of responsibility for my crew and my nephew kept me anchored to reality. But it was already too late. Half the crew was already on deck, in a trance, staring fixedly at the dark waters surrounding the ship. Their faces, usually marked by the hardships of life at sea, were now softened with an expression of almost childlike bliss. Glazed eyes, lips slightly parted, as if witnessing a divine vision. Eric, my boatswain, a man who had faced storms capable of splitting ships in half without so much as a shiver, was now openly weeping, silent tears streaming down his bearded face as he muttered unintelligible words. Lars, always so practical and rational, had removed his boots and coat, as if preparing for a swim in the freezing water. That's when I saw them. Feminine figures of indescribable beauty, rising from the waves as if they were part of them. They didn't swim but appeared to float atop the surface, which rippled around them in reverence. Their long, dark hair contrasted with pale skin that shimmered under the moonlight with a glow of its own, almost opalescent. Their faces held a perfection that surpassed human beauty. Large almond-shaped eyes of a blue so deep it seemed to contain the ocean itself. Delicate noses, full lips that moved in sync with that hypnotic song. Their smiles were seductive, inviting, promising pleasures no mortal had ever known. They sang in a language none of us recognized, yet we somehow understood it in our souls. These were not words we could interpret, but emotions, sensations, promises. Promises of comfort for weary hearts, adventures for restless spirits, wisdom for curious minds. Each man heard exactly what his heart most longed for. I myself, for a moment, thought I heard the voice of my late wife calling me from the depths, promising we would be together again, if only I joined her in those dark waters. The illusion was so powerful I took a step toward the rail before the image of Jens, entrusted to my care, pulled me back to reality. I shouted orders for the men to return to their posts, my voice raw with desperation. I tried to grab arms, block passageways, knock a few to the deck to stop them from reaching the rail, but my words seemed not to reach them, as if they were wrapped in an impenetrable bubble where only the creature's song existed. One by one, they began jumping into the dark waters, drawn by an irresistible force. There was no hesitation in their movements, no sign of fear or uncertainty. They leapt with beatific smiles, arms outstretched to embrace those alluring beings. I pulled Jens back as he too began walking toward the rail, seemingly hypnotized. His slender body trembled under my firm grip, and he struggled against me with surprising strength for someone so young. "Don't look at them!" I shouted, forcing him to turn away, covering his eyes with my calloused hand. "They're not women. They're predators." He continued to fight, murmuring about angelic voices and eternal beauty. I had to strike him, may God forgive me. A punch to the stomach that made him double over, gasping for breath, momentarily breaking the enchantment. His eyes focused again, confused and hurt by my action, but at least he was conscious once. More. It was at that moment that a piercing scream tore through the night, a sound so filled with agony it seemed impossible it had come from a human throat. One of my men, Eric, had reached one of the creatures. The moment his fingers touched that pale skin, the transformation happened. The creature's serene beauty dissolved like sand pulled away by the tide. Her face, oh God, her face twisted into something nightmarish, with jaws that unhinged, impossibly wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth layered like a shark's, but more numerous and jagged. Her eyes, once the purest blue, turned pitch black, without iris or pupil, only hungry voids. Within seconds, her delicate arms became claws that tore through Eric's chest as if it were paper. Blood sprayed in a dark arc against the night sky as the sound of bones being crushed echoed across the silent deck. The creature buried her face, now more like a monstrous eel's than anything remotely human, into the sailor's opened chest, feeding on his still pulsing organs. The waters around the ship quickly turned red as more men jumped in, only to be dismembered by those creatures. The shock of the first death seemed to partially break the enchantment for some, who tried to swim back to the ship only to be dragged under by pale hands rising from the depths with superhuman strength. The screams. I still hear them in my nightmares. Screams of men who suddenly awoke from the trance to find themselves not in the arms of beautiful women, but being torn apart by sea monsters. It wasn't death that awaited them. It was prolonged agony. The sirens. For now I knew what they truly were, didn't kill quickly. They seemed to savor the suffering, devouring their prey alive, piece by piece, keeping them conscious for as long as possible. I saw Lars, my loyal first mate, dragged away by 3 of those creatures. They tore his limbs methodically, passing chunks of flesh between each other like a macabre feast. His eyes met mine in his final moments, not with fear, but with a terrible, too late understanding. Gustav, the cook, a man who always had a joke or a story to lift the crew's spirits, was pulled under by something I couldn't see. For a moment, only bubbles marked the spot where he'd disappeared. Then the water turned red, and pieces of his body began floating to the surface. Young Mikkel, just 2 years older than Jens, managed to grab hold of the ship's side net after witnessing his companion devoured. For a brief moment, I thought, I could save him. I reached out my hand. Our fingers almost touched when a creature surged up beneath him, her expanded jaw engulfing half the boy's torso in a single bite. Blood sprayed against the ship's hull, and Mikkel's scream ended, in a wet gurgle before he was pulled beneath the surface. By the gods, Uncle. Jens screamed beside me, his face contorted in horror as he peeked through a gap between my fingers that still tried to shield his eyes. What are those things? Mermaids, I replied, the word leaving my mouth bitterly, as if saying it were a profanity. Not like in the stories your mother used to tell you before bed. Not like the paintings in our books. The reality is far crueler than any legend. As I dragged Jens away from that horrifying scene toward the relative safety of the cabin, I realized the singing hadn't stopped. It had changed, become more frantic, more primal, a wild celebration of the carnage unfolding around us. The creatures seemed to be communicating through that demonic melody, coordinating their attack with supernatural precision. In the shadows of the night, more figures began emerging from the depths. Dozens of them now circled the ship like vultures, around a carcass, their black eyes reflecting the moonlight as they watched the few survivors who hadn't yet jumped or been dragged into the waters. Some began to climb the hull with agile movements, their claws leaving deep gouges in the wood. The boldest were already reaching the lower deck, where the few sailors who had resisted the initial enchantment now fought desperately with whatever weapons they could improvise: harpoons, fishing knives, even broken pieces of the ship itself. But it was a losing battle. For every creature they managed to wound, 3 more took its place, advancing relentlessly with a hunger that seemed insatiable. I looked at Jens, his eyes wide with terror, his body trembling violently against mine. I had promised my sister I would protect him, that I would help make him into a man. Now, all I could do was try to save him from this nightmare, even if it meant sacrificing the rest of my crew. "Come on," I whispered, pulling him into the cabin. "There's nothing we can do for them now." Guilt consumed me as I closed the heavy wooden door behind us, muffling the agonized screams of the men who had trusted their lives to my leadership. Men who were now being devoured alive by monsters that should not exist outside the most terrible nightmares. In that moment, as I shoved a heavy table against the cabin door, I realized we had sailed beyond the known world, beyond the boundaries of the reality I thought I understood. We had entered a place where ancient legends proved true, and where humanity was nothing more than easy prey for creatures that had ruled this planet long before our existence. We barricaded the cabin door as the massacre continued outside. The screams of the crew blended with the inhuman shrieks of those creatures who had once sung with angelic voices. Now they cried out with harsh, triumphant sounds, like birds of prey celebrating a successful hunt. My heart pounded so hard against my ribs that I feared the creatures could hear it even through the thick wooden walls. Jens curled up in the farthest corner of the cabin, hugging his knees, his eyes fixed on some empty point. Shock had taken hold of him, and while it worried me, it was better than full awareness of the horror surrounding us. I couldn't offer words of comfort. What comfort could possibly exist after what we had witnessed? So I simply placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. Through a small porthole, I saw the deck soaked in blood. The wood, normally light, was now nearly black beneath the silver moonlight illuminating that hellish scene. I had counted 30 men under my command on this voyage. Men with families, dreams, stories. Men who had entrusted their lives to my decisions. Now they were nothing more than mutilated bodies, some still being dragged into the sea by pale claws, rising from the waves. In all my life at sea, I had seen death. I had watched men taken by storms, others succumb to strange diseases, some fall from masts or be crushed by heavy equipment. Death is a constant companion to those who choose the ocean as their home. But never, not even in my worst nightmares, had I imagined such a cruel end for my men. The knocking on the cabin door began only minutes later. At first, it was soft, almost hesitant, as if someone were politely asking to come in. Then, gradually, it grew more insistent, turning into violent pounding that made the thick wood tremble on its hinges. The table we'd shoved against the door jumped with each impact. "Valdemar, open for us," a melodic voice whispered through the wood. It wasn't a human voice. It was too sweet, too deep, as if multiple throats were singing in unison. "There's nowhere to run. We've lived here longer than your kind has existed. We know every wave, every current, every secret of this ocean. You belong to us now." Jens let out a muffled sob at the sound of that voice, and I saw silent tears streaming down his young face. I motioned for him to stay quiet as I frantically searched for something I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on the old whale sword hanging on the cabin wall. A family heirloom, more decorative than functional, but still sharp. The blows on the door intensified, now accompanied by sounds like nails or claws scraping against the wood. Outside, other voices joined the cruel chorus, calling our names with blood-freezing clarity. How did they know who we were? How did they know our names? Do exactly what I say, I whispered to Jens, my voice barely audible. When I count to 3, run to that chest, grab the flare, and be ready. Got it? He nodded, though his eyes showed only terror. He was too young to be here, too young to face this nightmare, but fate had given us no choice. A loud crack came from the door. The wood was starting to give. Pale fingers, far too long to be human, slipped through the forming cracks. 1, 2, 3. I lunged with the sword in hand as Jens ran to the chest. With all the strength I could muster, I struck the oil lamp hanging near the door. The glass shattered, spilling flammable oil across the already splintered wood, and the flames spread quickly as the wick dropped onto the liquid, the fingers creeping. Through the cracks recoiled with a hiss that sounded more like a scalded serpent. Fire, it seemed, was something these creatures feared, or at least, it would buy us time. Now, to the window, I shouted, running toward the small circular porthole. On the opposite wall, which looked out over the ship's stern, it was far too small for a grown man under normal circumstances, but desperation makes us surprisingly flexible. I smashed the glass with the sword's hilt, scraping my arms as I forced myself through the narrow opening. Outside, a small platform provided precarious footing. Below us, the dark waters churned, occasionally revealing flashes of black eyes and sharp teeth. I helped Jens through the opening, his narrow shoulders making it easier. He trembled violently but stayed focused, clutching the flare tightly. "The lifeboat is just below," I said, pointing to the small vessel suspended by ropes at the ship's stern. "We have to reach it." Behind us, the flames had spread rapidly, feeding on maps, books, and dry wood. The Havfruen, my faithful ship for so many years, was doomed. But if the fire kept the creatures busy long enough, we might have a chance. We slid down the ropes to the boat, scraping our hands and knees in. The process. The small craft rocked dangerously over the dark waters, which seemed to boil with movement below the surface. I knew they were watching us, waiting, ready to drag us down at the slightest mistake. When dawn finally arrived, after the longest night of my life, the silence was deafening. The Havfruen still burned, a funeral pyre for my men, sending a column of black smoke into the clear morning sky. Jens and I, trembling from fear and exhaustion, dared to look around. The deck was empty. Not a single body remained. Only dried bloodstains bore witness to the horror of the previous night. The creatures had vanished with the light, taking their gruesome trophies with them. What would they do with the remains of my men in the depths? I preferred not to imagine. But our nightmare was far from over. As we struggled to raise anchor with our limited strength to move the burning ship away from the cursed island, we spotted canoes approaching from the shore. In them were the Sentinelese, the island's human inhabitants, armed with primitive but deadly bows and spears. Their bodies, painted with elaborate patterns, gleamed under the sun, and their war cries echoed across the calm morning waters. "Quick, Jens! To the lifeboat!" We cut the ropes with the sword, already dulled by the night's events, and the small boat hit the water with a jolt that nearly threw us overboard. Grabbing the oars, we began to row desperately, trying to escape both the arrows raining from the sky and the waters that still harbored those monstrous sirens. An arrow struck Jens in the shoulder, tearing a muffled cry from him that he quickly stifled, aware that any sound might draw the creatures back. Blood ran down his arm, staining the boat's pale wood. I yanked the arrow out with a swift motion, ignoring his groan of pain, and tied a torn piece of my shirt around the wound to stop the bleeding. "Row, boy," I instructed, my voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Row like your life depends on it, because it does." The Sentinelese pursued us for a while, their agile canoes gaining on our overloaded lifeboat. But suddenly, they stopped inexplicably when we reached a certain distance from the island. It was as if an invisible boundary had been set, one they dared not cross. I looked back one last time, watching the silhouette of North Sentinel Island against the horizon. The Havfruen had become little more than smoldering wreckage by then, and the canoes had returned to the shore. And for a moment, just a brief moment under the bright sunlight, I thought I saw pale figures on distant rocks, watching us. By some miracle I'll never fully understand, we managed to drift far enough to be spotted by a British merchant ship 3 days later, dehydrated, delirious. Jens's wound had become infected, and he burned with fever, mumbling incoherently about songs in the dark and teeth in the waves. The captain of the merchant vessel, a man from Somerset named Holloway, took us in with generosity, though suspicion clouded his eyes as he heard the story we invented. We told our rescuers that a storm had sunk the Havfruen, and that we were the only survivors. Who would believe the truth? We'd be taken for madmen, or worse, for liars trying to cover up some heinous crime against our own crew. Jens survived the fever, though he remained silent for the entirety of the voyage back to Copenhagen. The only words he spoke were during his nightmares, when the terror of that night on the island returned to torment him. Years passed. Jens never sailed again. He married a woman from Aarhus, had 3 children, and settled as a carpenter far from the sea, far from the salt waters that haunted his dreams. But he never truly overcame the trauma. I could see it in his eyes every time we met on those rare occasions when family obligations brought us together. That distant look of someone who had glimpsed hell and could never quite unsee it. As for me, I returned to the sea, not out of courage, but cowardice. The ocean became my refuge and my penance. In ports, people called me the Ghost Captain, not just for my pale, gaunt appearance after the incident, but because I seemed to carry death with me. Ships under my command never lost another man. Perhaps fate felt it had already taken enough from me. In every port, on every voyage, I scoured old books and scrolls, searching for any mention of those creatures, trying to understand what really happened that night. I spoke with shamans in the Caribbean, Tibetan monks, Maori elders, anyone who might hold knowledge of the sea's secrets that the West had forgotten or never known. What I discovered was even more disturbing. The legends of the Sentinel, translated through cautious intermediaries living on less hostile nearby islands, speak of an ancient pact with deep-sea beings, guardians of the island who protect its isolation in exchange for occasional sacrifices. Rituals performed on nights of the full moon, when young warriors deliver prisoners from neighboring tribes to the shore and leave them bound at the water's edge. By morning, only polished bones remain. They do not fear the sirens, they revere them. In their myths, these beings were the first dwellers of the earth, forced into the depths when humans emerged. North Sentinel Island is sacred to them, a last bastion where the two worlds coexist in a fragile, bloody balance. In one particularly old Tibetan manuscript, I found an illustration that robbed me of sleep for weeks. It depicted creatures exactly like the ones I had seen, beautiful on the surface, monstrous once their true nature was revealed. The text called them dream eaters, claiming they fed not only on flesh, but on the desires and hopes of their victims, absorbing their souls along with their bodies. My health worsens with each passing day. The doctors say it's just age, that 72 is a long life for a man who spent decades braving the harshness of the sea. But I know it's not just that. It's the weight of this story, corroding my soul like salt eats away at metal. It's the accusing gaze of 30 ghosts that visit me in my nightmares, asking why I survived when they did not. Only Jens understands, and he is dying too, though 15 years my junior. A mysterious illness consumes his lungs, making him cough blood each morning. The doctors find no cause, but we both know. It's their song, echoing through time, slowly calling us back into their grasp. Before I join my crew in the cold embrace of the ocean, I leave this account as a warning. Not the vague and poetic warnings of drunken sailors in port taverns, but the sober testimony of a man who faced the unknown and survived only to bear the burden of the truth. There are mysteries in the ocean that should remain unexplored. There are islands that should remain untouched, and there are creatures that inhabit the border between worlds, using our own lust, greed, and curiosity as bait to lure us to our end. If you ever sail near North Sentinel Island and hear an irresistibly beautiful song coming from the dark waters, cover your ears and pray. Pray with all your might to any god who might still listen. For it is not beauty that calls you, but death in its cruelest form. And those who sing seek not your love or companionship, but the sweet taste of your flesh and the last breath of your soul as they devour you alive. They wait in the depths. They have always waited, and they always will, as patient as the ocean itself, until the last ship passes through their waters, and the last foolish sailor is seduced by their deadly song.